This is going to be a review of Pathwork Lecture 40, which was the topic for February 2017. I'm going to go into more detail this time because images is an extremely large concept in Pathwork. It's one of the few ideas where the guide talked about it for 4 lectures in a row. So 38, 39, 40, 41, actually 5 lectures in a row, 38 through 42. Anytime you spend 5 fortnights talking about an idea, you can get the idea that it's pretty important. So in any presentation on images, I'm naturally taking a massive subject and squeezing it down and just giving you an aspect of it. Now, in the study guide, I looked at it from one perspective. And what I do in these presentations is I try to do them after we've met during the month. Between 12 and 15 meetings are held during the month. And after I hear people working with the topic, I sometimes get a different perspective. It's not that I want to go back and change the study guide per se, but I see areas that are currently difficult for people to process, specific issues that come up that aren't necessarily addressed in the study guide. So when I made notes for the presentation, I realized that what I want to start off with, instead of telling you what an image is, I want to start from a different direction. And that is actually a good way to work with images. So it is important to have a concept what images are and understand false beliefs and misconceptions and so forth. But in actually finding them, it's very useful to just have some relatively simple symptoms to look for and then capture them based on the symptoms and bring them in. And the reason for this is that we ourselves are the ones generating the images. So if we pick and choose what to look at, we may unconsciously not choose the very thing that we need to work on. Now, how does that work? I've been doing a lot of reading and studying on the concept of unconscious bias. And in that realm of psychology, which you can Google, what they talk about is we see what we want to see. But in this case, we see what we unconsciously want to see rather than what we consciously want to see. And this brings up the discrepancy between the conscious and the unconscious. Now, in Pathwork, our unconscious is not our enemy, but it's just not ready to come forward is the most benign way I can describe it. The unconscious is not ready to come forward. The conscious mind is working with and able to grasp the things that we are ready to grapple with. So there's a certain degree of self-responsibility. Self-responsibility is a theme in the study of images. There's a certain amount of self-responsibility for what we find ourselves unable to address. Now, this is hard to understand in human social terms because we think if we can't see it or touch it, we can't be responsible for it. And this is where this kind of work is different from psychology. Just like in the law, which says ignorance, the U.S. law, ignorance is no excuse. The spiritual version of that would be ignorance is, but so is what that ignorance is attempting to hide. In other words, there's a choice in what we happen to be ignorant about. And we bear some responsibility, not guilt, just responsibility for those choices. So this is the conscious and unconscious is where a human being is in isometric tension with its desire to grow. Isometric tension is the kind of thing where your exercise, where you fight against yourself. So the spiritual being, the divine being, is struggling to grasp something or release something and yet not quite able to do it. It's a tug of war. Now, this tug of war comes to Earth. It's another set of Pathwork lectures. But this tug of war winds up manifesting as a human being. And that tug of war continues to manifest. And this is what you can look for in terms of symptoms. So a symptom of an image would be something that you cannot seem to overcome. A fault, a negative pattern, negative attitude. Now we need to be careful when we say it's something you cannot overcome, because if I say the mountain range prevents me from getting across, is that my image? No, that's a mountain range. But the image may have led me through multiple decisions to wind up at the base of the mountain arguing with the fact that the mountain, I can't get through because of the mountain. If I didn't have these images, I might have made a series of decisions, thousands of decisions, small decisions, or I didn't wind up in that particular place staring at mountains claiming I'm not responsible for the impasse, the mountains are responsible. A different series of decisions might have sent me to one side or the other of the mountain range to be able to find the way through, because there is no mountain range on the planet that doesn't have a pass somewhere. They end. So when we say we cannot overcome something, it is important not to bring evidence, but just to notice that there's something that we think we're trying to resolve and we seem powerless. Again, faults, character flaws, a negative pattern of behavior that may not make any sense, so we don't know how to fix it. It's irrational. How do you address something irrational? Or a negative attitude. I can't help feeling this way. Well, yes, you can, but you do have to backtrack a little bit and find the cause, which is based on the image. So some aspect of you that you can't seem to overcome, that is not actually a piece of concrete in your path. Another symptom of an image is a recurring negative pattern. Negative experiences tend to repeat themselves. So anytime you notice a pattern of behavior, even if there's only a delicate connection between them, that may indicate the existence of an image. So in other words, an image that women are inferior to men, or vice versa. The image that anyone is inferior to someone else inherently because of their sex, gender, race, intelligence, etc. Because in theory, intelligence should not change the inherent value of a human being. It may change what they can achieve, but not their inherent value. I'm speaking, of course, of a 21st century philosophy, which was not true hundreds and hundreds of years ago. But if I'm speaking today, I'm speaking within the culture of today. So recurring negative experiences that seem to fit a pattern, such as something you can define down to, I don't believe in the inherent value of all people. Well, you would think, well, why would I not believe that? And I'll explain some examples in a minute, but the image that could be behind that is spiritually, I believe that some beings are not equal to other beings. Again, not based on what they achieve, but inherent value. And if you believe that about others, then you believe it about yourself or you fear it about yourself. So the reason there's a pattern here in this particular example is that if I believe that beings are not inherently equal, then either I am superior than or inferior to other beings. If I am superior to, I need to retain that superiority because it can be taken away. And if I feel inferior, then I'm in fear and I'm trying to gain some kind of parity so that I will not be left behind, I will not be unloved, I'm not devalued. So what I'm trying to explain is in the real world, when we come up with a repetitive pattern of an inability to see value, in this instance between human beings, what can be under that is a fear that there isn't an inherent value. And that our desire to pick ourselves up, to elevate ourselves, prompts us to want to adjust the value of other people. So the lack of ability to respect and admire other people for what they are and what they achieve comes from our inability to accept ourselves as we are and what we have achieved. But that's very hard to admit. And that's the hard part about images, is they may represent something that we don't want to admit. Something that we inherently know is wrong or shameful, so wrong, that we won't come clean about it. Another symptom of an image would be a discrepancy. Now, this is one of my favorites. A discrepancy between conscious desire and what's actually happening. And the way I like to explain this is I use the example of a sea anchor. So a boat uses a sea anchor when they can't reach the bottom. So they throw overboard the equivalent of a bucket. It looks like a cone. And the current, the ocean, fills the cone with water and holds the boat from moving forward. And the reason I use this analogy is that's what an image does. It's as if the people in the boat say, let's go forward, but they can't. They can't make any headway. And the reason is there's an unconscious image, device, that they are not aware of, that is holding them in place, pulling in the opposite direction. So the consequence of these cross currents is discrepancy. So when I listen to people talk about their belief systems, I have trained myself, because I am a little impatient, but I've trained myself to sit back and be quiet and listen. And pretty soon I begin to hear one statement that indicates one set of beliefs and another statement that indicates an opposite belief or set of beliefs. And when I hear that, I bring it up as a discrepancy. Not you are wrong, this is right and this is wrong, how can you hold them both? Because that's not the point. The point is that there's a discrepancy. And a discrepancy is a great symptom to look for when you're trying to find an image. For instance, if someone says over and over, I want to be in relationship, but they just don't happen to ever be in relationship, that's a discrepancy. Because a genuine positive desire to be with other people would naturally produce being with other people. If I get pleasure out of the company of other people, I would tend to generate such company. What would hold me back from that is a fear of relationship. And this is where people often speak glowingly of the benefits of something, but they can never achieve it because unconsciously or semi-unconsciously, they're frightened of that. So these create a cross current where they can't make any headway on the so-called positive conscious belief because of the less conscious unconscious belief that they will be hurt, that it will be painful, that they will fail. So again, I picture this as a sea anchor holding us back. And once you realize it, you can bring up the anchor and sail on. So discrepancies between conscious desires. Sometimes the discrepancy is, for instance, I don't want to smoke, but I find myself picking up a cigarette. We have some automatic behavior that is driven by unconscious needs. that seems to bypass our conscious mind. Automatic eating, automatic spending, automatic watching television or frittering away time. Anything that you find yourself doing that later you say, if I'd realized what I was doing, I would not have done that, may be the harbinger, the symptom that there's an image working there. Once again, a cross current of some kind. The discrepancies are driven by the unconscious, where you don't know or understand what the forces are. I actually don't do well with abstract thought patterns. I find that I need to pin the tail on the donkey. I need to find a practical example of this in culture, in science, in architecture, in anything, in any human endeavor. I need to feel the mechanism of these abstract ideas. That's why I come up with examples such as a sea anchor, where naturally if you knew you had the anchor, you'd pull it up, but you don't know. So you're fighting and struggling and sobbing and distraught because you're doing everything you know how to move forward in life. And somehow you're moving very, very slowly, or not moving at all, or even going backwards. So I need these pictures to help me understand an abstract concept like this. Another symptom of an image is any fears, any avoidance, or any resistance. Fear is the key. The key element of an image is fear. And I'll explain that in the next section, because right now I'm just talking about symptoms. So if you focus only on the symptoms instead of going deeper and looking at belief systems, then hopefully you won't trigger an avoidance from the very belief that you're trying to find. So if you just look at the symptoms, look at things you can't overcome, recurring negative patterns or experiences, discrepancies, and fears, and you find some of these. The next step is to sense into what are the forces here. Now, I always reference other lectures for your entertainment and amusement. It's not that you have to have the other lectures, but I want to credit that I can talk about something more easily because I also understand other concepts. The other concept I'm bringing in right now is unity and duality, which is Pathwork Lecture 143. And in that lecture, the guide speaks about how the unitive or spirit is fear-free because it is life-affirming. It is who we all are at our best. But that this planet is a dualistic experience. This planet is full of either-ors, life or death, good or bad, right or wrong, hungry or not hungry. This is pleasurable, this is painful. So the construct of the world, by whosever hand, is a demonstration of dualistic thinking. And according to Pathwork, this is designed to bring forward our own dualities. So using this idea, if you trim it down, any dualistic thinking can be boiled down to whether something is life-affirming or deadly. Now, if it's life-affirming, we're going to move towards it. And if it's deadly, we're going to move away from it. So again, because sometimes abstract thinking is difficult for me, I go into my body, I have a lot of kinesthetic qualities, I'm able to feel things in my body that explain things to my mind in a very concrete way. So that when I am afraid of something, I try to feel in what part of it I'm trying to move away from. If I am attracted to something, I want to feel into what I'm drawn towards. Now, if it's healthy, I will be drawn towards it without being helped out by a running away quality. So you can think you're moving towards something when you're actually moving away from something else. So in terms of dualistic thinking, if you boil it down to life or death, you're always going to reach for life and avoid death. So in looking at images, once you've found some symptoms, consider for a while, what are you protecting yourself from? If this image is a solution, if this image is an answer, it's an answer to something. It's protection against something. It's a defense against an experience that you don't want to have again. So for instance, in relationship, we have many images about men and women, husband, wife, mother, father. The human experience is divinely concentrated in the relationship between two human beings. And if you're not in a relationship, use a friendship. It works just as well, even if it's not as intense. So in a relationship, there is always a fear of loving, a fear of who's going to have power and who's going to feel helpless. It may be small, it may be minor, but there's some concerns about how do we make decisions, and do we each get what we want on a fairly reasonable basis. And based on our histories with our parents and our families, we may have experienced something that we don't want to experience in our personal, intimate relationships, in our friendships. What I'm suggesting here is that even as we reach out in friendship, we may be running away from a negative experience. And this is one of the ways we can unearth some of our images. Notice, what are you protecting? What are you defending against? What are you running away from? And I encourage you to allow your imagination here. I don't think that I am unusual in using images and examples to bolster abstract ideas. I may be on one end of the spectrum and do it more than other people, but my experience of human beings is we all do it. Allow your imagination to bring forward images in the best sense of the word, in the sense of pictorial representations. Because your image is actually like that. The images that we're working on are like having little snapshots that are frozen in time. But they weren't well designed, they weren't well taken, and they were taken with a desire to prove something, so they're not completely fair pictures. But that doesn't mean that pictures, images, sensory experiences aren't very, very useful bits of information. It is also how your unconscious speaks to you. This is according to Patrick Lecture 124, the language of the unconscious. And the premise here is that we are divine beings. We are inherently here with a task to transform. And therefore, we know more than our conscious mind may realize. And we are going to be able to access what we're trying to do. In other words, this is not a game that is stacked against us. This is a game that we're designed to win, in the best sense of the word win, meaning there is no way to lose. There is a way perhaps to win more, to accelerate the learning. But there's an inherent design to our coming here to transform. That means that the evidence is here for us. And perhaps as a test of how really eager we are, that's what manifests as our willingness and our ability to see these things, to search for these things. When I speak to people who study pathwork, they tend to give me a lot of credit for helping them. And I feel that it's unfair to give me credit for the fact that they have searched for a spiritual path, they found the pathwork lectures, they have read and studied them, they have decided to commit to their own self-transformation process, and they have looked out and found one person, various people to help them. That it is important for us to take, once again, the word self-responsibility for having found the materials and not worry so much about, boy, this is very involved and difficult and I don't know where to start. Not worrying about that so much, but seeing if you can give yourself a pat on the back for finding something that interests you, that feels challenging for you, and that I would hope has a great deal of potential to bring more joy and pleasure into your life. So what I'm saying here is that this process of pathwork, of looking at images, presumes your positive intention to grow, and that if you open to it, you will be able to use the power of that positive intention to deal with the negative aspects of your life. Now, all that was about finding images by looking at the symptoms. One of the participants this month called this next section the rabbit hole, and it is a bit of a rabbit hole. The next thing I'd like to talk about is what an image is on two levels, and that's why it's a little bit of a rabbit hole. It's hard to track this. So I invite you to go read the lectures, go read the study guide, but I'm going to try to give you a more personal explanation perspective of this. Once again, I see images as a snapshot. It's as if we take a Polaroid picture at some point early on in our lives that represents what we believe in that moment. Now, when we take that snapshot, we're very young, very ignorant, very naive. We don't have the wisdom. We don't have the perspective that we have later as adults. We take that photograph and it seems to encapsulate either what we want or what the problem is. And what we call an image, it's as if that snapshot gets put in a special place in us and it never matures, it never gets reviewed, it never grows up, it never changes. So to some extent, we're all basing life decisions on an attitude, on a perspective that we began to cement into us when we were 1, 2, 3 years old. In the meetings, I tend to join in and give personal examples that don't feel appropriate on YouTube, but I do find that everybody has an experience of this. So I use generic examples here. And one would be that if you were frightened by a dog when you were very, very young, you don't know dog in general. You don't know the theory of dog, the history of dog and mankind. All you know is this particular kind of animal hurt you or frightened you. And if you have 2 or 3 of those kinds of incidents, it is very easy to cement those in and come up with an image that this particular type of animal is dangerous. And if there's no particular reason, no support in your family to soften that image and help you understand that that was only one dog in one situation or 2 or 3 dogs in a row, supposed coincidence, and you do need to get over the feeling that that would apply to all dogs. If somebody is not ready and willing to support you there, then you may grow up with a certain amount of fear that can extend beyond pets to all animals, or can center on a particular kind of energy that even human beings can result. So if you laugh teasingly about it, some people do behave like little yappy dogs, and some people behave like large, sleepy Labradors, and some, you get the idea. There's a spectrum of human behavior that we could teasingly assign to different kinds of dogs. If you're afraid of one energy in a dog, you could easily be afraid of that same energy in a human being. So you're projecting your fear from your childhood incident with a dog onto a grown person at work or among your acquaintances. And it's going to prejudice your interactions with that person. That's a very simple example of an image. So an image is a snapshot that doesn't show the whole picture. It's on the human level. It's based on a certain amount of ignorance and naivete. And then there is the spiritual level. And this is where the phrase going down the rabbit hole comes from. On a spiritual level, there was a reason why you magnetized that experience to you in the first place. Because it represents something much deeper. Now, you can work with images on a human level, and you can work with images on a spiritual level. And I'm being silly because there's a spectrum here. But it feels important to not leave this in the realm of, I'm afraid of dogs, how can you untraumatize me? That this goes deeper into a belief that a certain high level of activity is dangerous, which can be based upon a misunderstanding of the active principle. In pathwork, there's the description of masculine and feminine is spoken about in terms of the concept of the active and the receptive, not the passive, but the receptive, and that these must always be in balance. Even if one is more prominent than the other is there and may come forward as appropriate. And while there may be a tendency for men to exhibit more active than receptive and women to do the opposite, that doesn't mean that any individual should definitely act in any given way, that there's not a right or wrong about this. What I'm getting to is remembering the incident of the dog, which I try to keep simple examples so I can use them in various circumstances. If you go back to the example of the dog with the yappy energy, the overactive energy, and then you project that onto humans, and you say, too much activity makes me nervous. The spiritual cause of that could be an unease with the active principle. And if you remember what I said about unity and duality, one is life and one is death. If overactive is death, then you're going to be prejudiced towards the receptive. And when we are prejudiced, we go into distortion. So the receptive that you might be attracted to might be an exaggerated version. And that's where the confusion between receptivity and passivity comes in. Just because there's an image of receptive as waiting. Waiting is a very active process. It is not the passive process that it is often made out to be. The passive would be a distortion. So what I'm speaking of here is you can have the images on the human level, and then there are images on the spiritual level. Now, on the spiritual level, there's a truth that is very difficult for people to grasp. And that is we kind of know it's not true, and we're still resistant to giving it up. In other words, even on a spiritual level, we're not completely comfortable with spiritual law, with God, with creation, with the plan of salvation. There's a part of us that wants to hold something back. And this is the wrong belief, misconception, distortion that generates the images that then manifest in day-to-day activities in our lives. I realize that's a little complicated. Perhaps you understand now why the guide spent 5 lectures in a row talking about it. So we have images, and understanding that wrong beliefs cause images. Images then cause pseudo-solutions. Pseudo-solutions meaning false solution. You can think of them as a shortcut, a way of thinking that manifests the image into I don't want to ever be around dogs. I don't like active people. People who talk and interrupt too much irritate me, and I don't want anything to do with them. That is the shortcut. I can relieve my anxiety by not having those experiences. And an even further shortcut is to condemn how those people behave, how those dogs behave, by basically judging them as bad and wrong. So anything we judge bad and wrong is very susceptible to being a pseudo-solution, a way for us to avoid a deeper recognition of something. So the pseudo-solutions, shortcuts, almost like memory aids, are the effects of the image. They are grounded in stories and examples and in rationalizations. We create our own evidence. Now, perhaps you can hear, as I described this, that if we don't want to do something, we need to have a good reason not to. So this is where we pick the stories. We pick the evidence. We remember the incidents that fit our images, and we do not remember the stories, the incidents that don't fit our images. This is where we hear what we want to hear and see what we want to see. Perhaps you can see here that when an image is deeply set in us and moving along in our lives unconsciously, it's driving part of our life, we may build up such a case for that point of view that we find ourselves trapped. We don't know how to undo it. Now, keep in mind that if you have done that, then we go back to looking for the symptoms of the image. It's as if we don't expect you to turn yourself in for what you don't understand and what you can't grasp. That's okay. Look for the evidence that it's not consistent. Look for the symptoms of the image and work backwards. And this is where there's a mythic, heroic quality about this work, where we are turning ourselves in, where we are finding the evidence that leads back to our own, I'll use the word guilt in the terms of real guilt, where we have hidden away from ourselves our resistance to spiritual law, and we're now uncovering it. It is an extremely uncomfortable process, and it's going to trigger our defenses. Being exposed like this is like being called a liar or a thief and deeply believing that we are liars and thieves. And while there's a grain of truth to that, the grain of truth is not nearly as much as we exaggerate it to be, because we're resistant to seeing that grain of truth, that little piece of us where we don't want to be fair with others, we don't want to share with others, where we're afraid to be real with others. Makes us a thief. We are stealing our own energy from the creation of the universe. I think I said that badly. Let me try again. I sometimes try to shortcut something I believe very profoundly in. I believe that we are all divine. I believe that the greatest thing we can do is open our hearts and give ourselves to the world. And when we don't do that, it's as if we're stealing something from other people. And that's what I mean by we are thieves. We are stealing, but we're not stealing so much from someone as we're stealing from ourselves. And we're stealing from what we can contribute. So, to get back to images. So we have images, and then we have the pseudo-solutions that support the image. Another way of saying this would be, if the image, then the pseudo-solution. If the active principle is a bad thing, an out-of-control thing, then active personalities are also bad. Then people who act in that way should be suppressed. You can see where this chain of thought moves on, so that by the time you're on one end, you can't connect very easily to the original spiritual issue. Okay? So if we start with the evidence we have, and we look at what we're running away from, and we very gently go back and take it apart, we have an opportunity to explore deep-set belief systems that we may not be fully conscious we have. Another contributor to images are some misconceptions about human life. Now, keep in mind that we're human, and sometimes it's hard to see our divine nature because we've got this humanity in front of us, and we're thinking with human minds in a world that has very dualistic consequences for certain activities. But the misconceptions are basically believing that bad things should not happen. And that's more about bad things shouldn't happen to me than a really altruistic bad things should not happen. So the misconception of bad things should not happen presumes that we would grow and transform and become generous and love each other equally if only bad things did not happen. That's not usually true. I am very fond of a quotation from the play Tea House of the August Moon. And it is said several times during the play. And that is that pain makes man wise. Pain makes man think. Thought makes man wise. And wisdom makes life endurable. And when I read Pathwork, I find that my fondness for that phrase is echoed in the words of Pathwork, that painful experiences on this planet lead us to uncover our images. It is a spiritual task, a spiritual goal, to uncover our basic nature and to release wrong beliefs and misconceptions. And it is hard to see things that way when we're dealing with hunger, thirst, threats, perceived or real. It's so easy to go into right, wrong, dualistic thinking. Instead of accepting, I am here and I am dealing with this. How can I be more loving, more wise, more courageous in this moment? And the answer is often if I can find my fears and I can calm them so that I'm not afraid, then I can reach into my deeper self and bring it forward, and I will be more loving, more courageous, and more wise. So misconception that bad results should not happen, which if you trace it back and admit it, means bad things shouldn't happen to me. Even if that's just, I shouldn't see bad things happen. I shouldn't feel bad because something happens. And this is a place where another section of this lecture talks about self-responsibility. I need to be responsible for the fact that I'm looking for my own comfort rather than the greater good of mankind. I can speak about it in the words of greater good of mankind. But I need to admit where I'm doing that in order to get what I want. I want to be happier. I don't want to worry about other people. I don't want to wonder what I can do, what more I can do. I don't want to leave my home, give away my money, spend my time. So if the bad things didn't happen, I would be perfectly happy. So wrong beliefs and misconceptions are based on bad results should not happen. And the difficulty with images is that since we've built all this evidence where we only see what we want to see, then we're always looking for proof that what we want is the correct thing to want. It is the right answer, the good answer, the appropriate answer. So this is where we've got an unconscious prejudice driving us. So the guide makes it's a more extensive list than I'm going into here of basic life misconceptions. that might be interesting to look at. So that's part of the rabbit hole. The second part of the rabbit hole of finding the deeper meaning in images, and once again, you can find it on a human level, on a personality level, on a sociological level, cultural, national, and spiritual. There's no right or wrong way to do this. You do what you are called to do. The guide lists a number of steps where you can, on how to find images. Now, it's in the lecture, it's in Pathwork Lecture 40, but the guide will say first or second, and then he won't say third, fourth, fifth sometimes. So you have to sift it out. And I sifted out 8 points from the lecture. First is that you're going to need to gather a large amount of isolated information for quite a while. And what that means is that you need to be free of your own prejudices. You need to gather a lot of information. If you gather a small amount of information, you may be ignoring certain things. And you need to gather it over a time period because you can have good weeks and bad weeks. And in a good week, you can say, I don't have a problem. And in a bad week, you can say, I have nothing but problems. It is important to see a healthy slice of your own life. You need to see the good and the difficulties, okay? You need to watch out for your own image censoring. And that's hard when you're deciding what to write down. So the key is outlined in Pathwork Lecture 28, which is Daily Review. And it says, focus on the disharmonies in your life. Now, there may be disharmonies in your harmonies. You may be falsely happy. But that's a difficult place to work. It is much easier to work in the areas where you're already unhappy because you're motivated to work there. So if there are any false harmonies, let them go for now. Focus on the disharmonies, meaning something resonates in a way you don't like. It may not feel bad or wrong, but that's why the word disharmony is a lovely word here. So that you write down every day 5 to 10 events that were disharmonious and put them aside. And I have a lot of materials online about Pathwork Lecture 28. And what I keep saying is keep it short because you don't want to get lost in the words here. You want to keep it as succinct as you possibly can. Because what you're going to do weeks or months later is you're going to start sifting through that information. And you want to be able to do it quickly. So gather a large amount of seemingly isolated information for quite a while. Secondly, notice consecutive chain reactions. This is called vicious circle. I'll get to that in a moment. Or patterns. It doesn't mean identify the main patterns yet, but just notice how this seems to always lead to that. And this happens, and then that happens. And that there's a sequence of events that seem to happen around your disharmonies. The third point is to verbalize these concisely. The guide says he can't emphasize enough how important this is. You need to bring words to your concerns so that they are real to you and not just passing thoughts in your head. So to verbalize these concisely, use your imagination. What could the wrong conclusion be that drives these events? And a little objectivity is useful here. Rather than saying, where am I wrong? You want to say, look at this series of events. Well, what kind of belief could be driving this? What would this person be running away from or running away towards? Running away from death, running towards life as a solution to death. So be creative with this. Now, one of the premises of the path work is that we know more than we realize. That we not only came here to transform, we have all the tools we need to transform. but we may need to become more mature, become adults before we can really access these mature spiritual abilities. The premise is you've got them. So consider when you are imagining what might be going on, that you might actually name something that's true, and then your mind says, oh, that's silly. Mother used to say that, and I always knew she was wrong. Well, someone can say that the truth is not the truth, and it can still be the truth. So, number one, let your imagination flourish here. And secondly, consider that you're trying to hide something from yourself. So when you come up with an idea that you are arguing about with yourself, let it stay. Verbalize it. Don't shoot it down. Let it stay. Believe that you might know more than you realize. And this might be the first verbalization you have that says, yes, even though somebody I didn't like said it wasn't true, it still might be true, or it still might not be true. And as you verbalize these chain reactions, write them down. Once again, a sentence is sufficient for this. If you write 15 sentences, you might get lost in your words. Point number 4, to look at what connects these dynamics. You can imagine now we've got, it's like being a scientist. You've got a whole bunch of raw data results, and then you're noticing connections, and then you are coming up with a theory, and then you're saying, I have 4 theories. Do they have anything in common? Okay, what is their common denominator? This is the work of finding images. It's handy to find some simple images first to go through the process, because as perhaps you can imagine, some of these images are going to be with you for a significant amount of your life, for decades. And those are going to be much, much harder to find than a small image that develops or shows up in a fairly minor cycle. The 5th point is that images always repeat. And that's why we're always looking for patterns. Images always repeat. They don't go away. That's their power, is they're impacting more of our lives than we realize. Number 6 is to find the breaking point of the image. Now, in this, I focus on using Patrick Lecture 50, which is a vicious circle. And in it, I simplify things by saying, look at the circle like it's a clock face. Now, not everybody needs all 12 points, but it's handy to notice a certain dynamic. And in terms of the breaking point of the image, I find that there are 3 breaking points. One is at the 12 o'clock when you first begin a pattern, and some voice in you says, been here before, and just slows things down. You may still go through it, but it may be much faster, simpler, and less negative than you have experienced before. Second breaking point is as you try, fail, there's a point where you try harder and then you slip into the harshest negativity of the vicious circle, called point 4, or 4 o'clock on the vicious circle. That's a chance for you to say, wait a minute, I have been here. I know this place, and I don't want to go into this negative chain reaction. And the third place where you can most easily break out of the vicious circle is the 8 o'clock position, where you've gone through your struggle and you've been in the depth of despair, and you make a commitment, I don't want to do this again. I'd like to take a fresh look at this. So these are breaking points of the image of the vicious circle, and they can be useful to know about them in advance, so that when you feel it in the middle of an argument or in the middle of your day, you can say, oh, okay, I think I understand where I am in this. And I may not be able to solve it now, but I will remember, and I'll use this material to work with. The 7th point the guide makes is to meditate upon this daily. Now, I am not a meditator. What I learned was that the word meditate does not involve sitting cross-legged in a specific place. I learned to meditate while I was commuting. I learned to meditate while I was doing laundry or housework. I learned to meditate while I was waiting in line. It made waiting in line, the time flew, because I was I had something to do while I was standing in line. Now, I did this 20 years ago when phones were dumb. So we have smartphones today. Just notice times when you're spending time on your phone. If you just closed it for a moment and used that time to contemplate, go over your daily review, go over your patterns. 5-10 minutes a day can be a tremendous investment in finding images, resolving negative situations, and bringing more pleasure into your life. And the last point the guide makes in this finding of images is fear will always tell you that an image is active. Fear is always running away from something or forcing you to choose something or go towards something. There's a lot of information in the Pathwork about fear that I can't go into right now, but it's just a key that fear always indicates some kind of image is operational. The last part of this lecture was about bringing unconscious beliefs into consciousness. I'm going to read a quote from Pathwork Lecture 124, which is the language of the unconscious. And it says there that messages of the unconscious come forth through the major problems in life, through repetitive patterns, any fulfillment or lack. So in that one sentence, it encapsulates what I've been saying, more or less, about images. And this is part of the fun of the Pathwork lectures, is sometimes you can find an explanation in one lecture. Once you understand a lecture, you can find that one sentence in another one encapsulates the spirit of the entire lecture. So again, as we bring our unconscious beliefs into consciousness, it is important for me to remember that we are divine beings. We've come here to transform. That the evidence of our task is in plain view. We're not being punished by being given an impossible task. This is not a Rubik's Cube beyond our capacity to resolve it. And that the images represent our active resistance to being in alignment with spiritual law. And that's a humbling thing to realize. And it can sometimes form the nucleus of resistance to the work. To say, that's ridiculous. I can't possibly be in resistance. I'm trying too hard. I invite you to try it on just as an experiment. The idea that your difficulties in life are caused by a certain stubbornness, a certain resistance, a certain fear. That if you surrender to however you conceive of the divine, that you will lose yourself. Pathwork teaches that the opposite is true. You will find yourself. That you are important. That you matter. And that you carry a divine gift for which the plan of salvation will never be in total unity without. Without you, we cannot be whole. So thank you for listening to this presentation on the Pathwork concept of images encapsulated in Pathwork Lecture 40. Ta.